I'm John Atack still, and I am delighted to welcome my friend Dr. Steven Moffic. Hi, Steve.
Hi, John, and hi, everybody out there.
And we've got a really complicated business going on because we have various topics that we might discuss, and one of them I've been reading a lot about the civil rights movement in the last few weeks, and it's really alerted me to the significance, particularly of music. People like Nina Simone and Harry Belafonte, who was so engaged and so courageous in their involvement, and the way that in the US, particularly, that through the beginning of the 20th century, through the first decades of the 20th century, there was this terrible segregation, this contempt towards black people. And that I remember watching a jazz critic who was saying, it's in Ken Burns' Jazz, and he says, yeah, when I was a young man, I was taught that black people are a different species to us, and
Yeah.
they're kind of apes, and that kind of thing. And then I saw Louis Armstrong,
hmm
and he was the only brilliant person I'd ever seen, and so that was the end of that thought. So, and wonderful things happen. But so we have that. We also have the, as with probably most of the people watching this, we're deeply concerned about what's happening in Gaza and Israel at the moment. So these are going to spur us to some sort of conversation. Who knows what? Do you want to open and say something about the Milwaukee Festival that you say is going to happen? You lead us in.
yes. Just to mention or react to your jazz comments, I think
Mm.
my own history of involvement with jazz was crucial for whatever comfort I have cross-culturally with people, whether that's ethnicity or religion. And we can get back to that. But one of the famous jazz musicians named, I think it was Albert Eiler,
Mm.
a saxophonist, said that music is the healing force of the universe. And he's not the only one that said that, but it's probably attributed most to him.
Mm.
And in the midst of this Mideast crisis here in Milwaukee, and particularly in the Jewish community, but also in the Muslim community here in Milwaukee, and even more generally, the challenge is, how do we react to that and also maintain our own mental health?
Mm.
David Brooks last week for the New York Times wrote an article, something like, how do we maintain mental health in these brutal times?
Mm.
And he went on to confirm what he thinks is going on with our mental health, which is being challenged by great losses, grief, trauma, which both overlap, fear, anger, and so on and so forth.
Mm.
And he was trying to find a solution or a way to help with that. And he referred back to the ancient Greeks and the Abrahamic religions. But at the end, he said, I don't think people can do this. I think most people are, I'm afraid, just going to keep having their mental health challenges now,
Mm.
which is quite offsetting. And I thought, that's not really true. And I've been trying to talk with community leaders about what we could do. One of the things and I can mention that in a moment. And one of the things they already had scheduled was a musical event where leading musicians in Milwaukee area would play both Israeli and I believe Arabic music coming this week, and invite the community to that. So something kind of more uplifting, and music, especially without words, can affect emotions greatly and
Mm.
hopefully positively. It's been my sort of personal therapy over the years.
Yeah, oh, me too.
So,
Yeah.
so we're going to have that event and many others. What I'm looking to potentially do, um, it could be with one group or mixed groups, is sort of a town hall where we could process how we're dealing with this tragedy. Lots of mixed feelings, but I don't think, if you're friends, you might share how you're feeling with each other, of course, but with strangers, That's not happening. I think the more people that get together to talk about this, maybe and do it nicely. So we need moderators,
Mm,
like a combined psychiatrist and clergy. But I
yeah.
think the more you hear how other people are reacting and why, I think the better that is in the long run.
Mm.
And it definitely is not good to keep your feelings all to yourself. Those will usually catch up with you later and cause more problems, especially with traumatic stuff, but even grief.
Mm.
So that's where we are right now. I, of course, have been writing columns, not surprisingly, since I write one most every weekday for Psychiatric Times
Mm.
about what's going on there. And I'm trying to do it in a way not to really focus on one side or the other and blame one side or the other, but just what it's doing to us emotionally and mental health wise,
Mm.
and with the hope that at least psychiatrists could come together from the different faiths. But I'm afraid right now it's pulling us more apart than together.
Yeah, and I mean we can always go to history and say, your granddad hit my granddad first. I mean, here's one to annoy some people, doubtless, because the narrative is so established. But the reality is that the 3 million or so German speakers who were in the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia were being persecuted by the Czech speakers. And that's a little point that we don't want that in history because it
Right.
interferes with the narrative of the Nazis being all bad. They were 99% bad, but nonetheless, that sometimes there are events before. And what's happened in Israel Palestine has roots that are so deep, go back millennia for both of the populations. And what seems to me to have happened is my study in the 1990s, having grown bored or just had spent too much time studying cults, religious and therapy cults, I thought I'd give myself a break and study terrorism. And that didn't prove to be much fun either, frankly. And Hamas was one of the groups that I looked at way back then.
Mm-hmm.
And they are a cult group. If we are going to define cult groups, they're an authoritarian group that is determined to gain certain objectives without concern necessarily for reasoning, logic, or any consideration of the outcome of what they're doing. And I was horrified when they were voted into power in 2006 in the Gaza Strip. I had a great deal of confidence in Mahmoud Abbas on the West Bank. I thought they were doing the right things there to get to a solution. But we can understand why the Palestinians are not feeling very happy. And we talked about civil rights for particularly the black community in the US, and Palestinians have not had the same rights as Israelis. And it's this tit for tat that just keeps on going. You have many Israelis, talk about music, the East West Sudan, Hans Ashkenazim, specifically formed an orchestral group that had Arabs and Jews in it, and was very successful and was very good. And he's one of the most brilliant men of his generation, a great pianist. But
Yeah.
then came the point where Tel Aviv University said, we can't take Arabs in anymore because they keep coming in and blowing things up. And the divide, the attempt to bring these populations together. On the other hand, I have absolutely no time for Benjamin Netanyahu and his ideas and the violation of UN orders to stop settling the West Bank, which have been ignored tens of times now. So we have, and I think it's so often happened. I was actually in this study of called Deeply Divided, which is a sociological study of the US and how the partisan politics has come along. And they have some very interesting statistics which basically say, well, actually, it's not the population that are divided, it's the politicians that are divided.
Right.
And they're fighting each other over issues which for most people are not necessarily primary issues even. And so, a friend of mine put it to me, and I hate to repeat this, but I'm going to, that you have two political parties in the US. You have warmongers who are opposed to abortion and warmongers who are for it. That's the division. And it is an incredibly important issue. Of course it is. But the issues of, poverty, and need are stronger issues in the US, where 25% of people live below the poverty line.
Yeah.
And it's sort of getting away. The extremists tend to be the people leading groups like Hamas or the fragmented Israeli government. And it's how we as people can, is there something we can do to overcome that? Like the women's movement in Northern Ireland that brought truth and reconciliation into Northern Ireland. And, where women told their husbands, you've got to stop doing this. This is no good anymore. And is there anything that we can do? I have friends, two of my friends who are both, in fact, Jewish, good friends, have come to the same conclusion that I have. We can't watch the news anymore. What's happening? And I realized that this is the first time this has ever happened to me in my life, that I've just gone, I can't stand this. What's happening here? So
yeah. So you're probably doing it for your mental health. That's one of the strategies I bring up. If watching the news is overwhelming and bothering you too much emotionally, forget about it. I sort of have to watch it because I write about this stuff. But then again, I'm so used to hearing horrifying news and situations. Being a psychiatrist, it's like, okay, here's some more.
Well, I'm writing a book about Charles Manson, so
right. So, the
tolerance,
possibility of getting secondary trauma from doing that book, like I got seeing patients and from other exposures is high. The only way to kind of stop that from happening is to have people you can share the information with and that go along with your values and support you. Now, and when I was seeing patients, I actually couldn't do that very much because I couldn't tell family and friends who I was seeing.
Of course,
I could talk to other colleagues, but not family and friends. So that's a big challenge. And what to do about it? I think I end a lot of my columns with that sort of question. Can psychiatrists do anything to help this stuff? You mentioned the women in Ireland, and there's that old Greek story of the women withdrawing from sexual relations, and that finally got the men to change. So I don't know, maybe there's something along that line. I think from the psychiatric side, we haven't. I'm not sure it's that we haven't been interested in these social problems, but we've stayed away from participating in public debates about it nowadays. I think part of that is the offshoot of the Goldwater rule, which was that we should not ethically talk about a public figure who we haven't examined personally and gotten permission. So I think that's kept psychiatrists away in general, because it's hard to talk about some of these issues without talking about the public leaders and figures like you just mentioned. And that's changing. We're getting more authoritarian leaders now. I think part of that is the disruptions we have in society, the rapid change, the influence of the internet, and so on. But I do think, and I've mentioned this, I think even on here, that so many of these social issues can be considered to be social psychopathologies, which means you can medicalize these problems and research them from a medical psychiatric viewpoint and maybe come up with some new solutions. The challenge with that is, for some cultures, racism and sexism, etc., are just embedded in the cultures. They serve what seems to be a cohesive force. So, you could either come across as being insensitive culturally or from my point of view, viewed as a colonialist gang, whatever. But it's hard to isolate those psychopathologies as I see them out somewhat from normal cultures. But I think it needs to be done, and maybe even a whole classification of all these social psychopathologies, which would include cults, cultish thinking, burnout, massive social problem in the United States, and I think elsewhere, racism, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and so forth. So, in the meanwhile, my one attempt basically is to try to bring people together. For instance, I would love to see a rally or a protest that would combine people for Palestinians and people for Israelis, with their common goal is people for peace.
Yes.
Because we have all these rallies around the world now. Most of them are more strongly pro-Palestinian, and I agree with what you said about them. I think the suffering of any people, especially innocent people, from a medical standpoint, is just taboo. And then there's protests of supporting the Jewish point of view, and there's actually some division within the Jewish community, because there's also rallies for Jews who are for peace and stopping the fighting right now. But I haven't seen any peace rallies which combine pro-Palestinians and pro-Israelis and Jews that would protest together and show a model. So I'm trying to advocate that a little bit too. In the meanwhile, I'm not all that optimistic, but those are kind of initial steps I'm taking. But these problems are so long, as you say, and so recalcitrant. And I could, in my own mind, and I've written about this before, I can trace this back to the story, and I underline story. There's not clear whether there's any truth to it, but the story of Ishmael and Isaac in the Old Testament Bible. And so, in the Jewish version of it, Sarah, Abraham, who was the first patriarch, and his wife Sarah couldn't have children. And Sarah was apparently given permission by God to have her handmaiden Hagar conceive with Abraham. And Abraham went along with it, and they had Ishmael. And it seemed like they were happier for a while. And then Sarah still wanted to try to have her own child, and apparently God went along with it, and along came Isaac. Maybe it's hard to know how many years, because years and age in the Bible don't quite make sense, but more than several years younger. And then Sarah thought Isaac was either getting bothered too much by his stepbrother, or Sarah was starting to favor Isaac more and said, "You and Hagar have to leave." And Abraham went along with it. And God tried to help them in the wilderness and promised them their own people. So you had Abraham, who was supposed to lead the formation of a people, Jewish people, and then you had Ishmael, which in the story, or I should say the interpretations of the story, a lot of the interpretations say he was a progenitor of the Arabs to come. So we have this family break. We know that family breaks are the hardest to repair, and take this all the way back in history. And then over and over again, there's arguments of whose land this is in Israel and the Gaza Strip and the surrounding areas. And then you have both sides being fought by the other. And in the current one, I'm sure Israeli politicians felt humiliated by what happened. Once humiliation occurs, there's usually a quest for revenge. and revenge happens over and over in history. And then you have the intergenerational transmission of trauma, which keeps everything going. And so no wonder this is so hard to break now, and for the people, for the old family to come together again in some peace.
Yeah, and I mean, once a blood feud is established, it continues down the generations, and
Yeah.
The mafia have vendetta. There's a statement by a Cherokee, that the first Cherokee to go on record with Europeans, told a Spanish explorer, "We live to fight war. That's the purpose of our society." And when Friedrich Engels suggests that the matriarchy would be the way forward for human society, one would like to point out the Cherokees were a matriarchal society, as were the northern Iroquois.
Good point. Then we have Thatcher leadership, and then we have Golda Meir, who led right in the midst of the Yom Kippur War. Yeah, it's
Indira
not
Gandhi,
necessarily completely a gender issue. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That we mistaken pursue something. But the Cherokee later realized that they were not going to be able to hold their own against the European settlers, and so they became an agricultural people. And their northern neighbors, and Cherokee are sometimes called Southern Iroquois, but the Northern Iroquois famously, the 5 tribes and later a 6th one, joined together in the Iroquois Confederacy, which is said to, in some ways, prefigure the American Revolution and the formation of the Constitution. This was a very important thing. And they gave us an expression, which is to bury the hatchet, to take the weapon of war, dig a hole and put it into it, which they did literally. The Hurons, the Algonquin, all peoples up there, this was something they'd do to signify, we are not going to do that anymore. And how on earth we can get to a situation where there's now so much hatred, so much violence, so much bloodshed, where people say, well, there are 2 possible futures here. One is we keep on doing this until one set of people has exterminated the other. And 2 is we work our way through this and find some way of settling this down. And that would, it could well be that what the Israeli Defense Force is doing now will completely sway world opinion against Israel.
Possible, yes.
Yeah. We know that Israel can only maintain this offensive with billions of dollars from the US in weapons. And so, we're at a very strange moment in history where Joe Biden could have turned round and said to Netanyahu, we're withdrawing all aid if you do that. Right now, we're taking it away, executive order. He decided not to do that. And one can understand that position too. But, the conflict has been going on in the Middle East since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire in 1918. It's not stopped. And the Western powers, particularly France and Britain, put dictatorships in place. In Lebanon, the French said, we're going to have a democracy as long as you're Christian. And if you're a Christian, you could vote, and a man, of course, And but putting the House of Sword in Saudi Arabia there, this idea of overthrowing the Iranian democracy in 1953, which was the British and the Americans together, and indeed a relative of Roosevelt, Kermit Roosevelt, unfortunate name that, given what happened with the Muppets later on, who goes in and they put the Shah of Iran in, one of the worst dictators in all history, one of the most savage. I had the strain. I spent 6 months going to Tai Chi classes 30, 40 years ago. And the guy teaching them had been in the bodyguard, the Shah's bodyguard. And if anything was mentioned about Iran, you could see him just crumple with his recollection of the horrors he'd seen there. I don't think he participated, but I think he was there when it was happening. I think, in fact, he was training the bodyguard in taekwondo or karate or something like that. And just seeing, how man passes misery on to man, that in the end we are, Tony Blair, when the Good Friday Agreement happened in, 1999, and theoretically the war in Ireland was finally over after the loss of, after 30 years and the loss of 3,000 lives. And he said in an interview, in the end, you have to talk with terrorists. That was shortly before the attack on Iraq, of course, to get to terrorists. But I think the point he was making, even though he's a hypocrite, absolutely, that point is valid. In the end, we're going to have to talk. Let's talk sooner rather than later. Let's sit down and talk with each other, as you say, that by discussing and by having some kind of moderation, so that the terrible inflamed emotions that of course you're going to feel, I've said often enough, I'm absolutely against capital punishment, but if you hurt one of my children, I'll kill you. So I understand that atavistic feeling inside myself. So I understand that for me to sit on the sidelines, nice and safe, and comment on what these, I don't fully have the right to do that. But having, you and I both have spent time with people who are very polarized in their opinions. They've come to a determination that is based upon hatred, that is based upon the desire to eradicate something because they believe that they'll feel better emotionally once they've done that. Well, I think the Nazis pretty much proved that Germans didn't feel better after the Holocaust. It did not make people, made some of them feel better, but really, thankfully, a tiny minority of horribly ill people.
Well, you feel better temporarily,
Mm.
and that's a reinforcing force in itself. Yeah, I mean, we're talking about some basic aspects of human nature which are hard to come. The most obvious one is a fear of somebody who's different, and fear could be physical, it could be about beliefs, power, morality. And when you develop this fear individually and in groups, what's your first response? It's in that fight, flight, freeze area. And the fight response is what gets us in trouble the most. And usually then we project onto others the things we don't like among ourselves and blame them for it. And certainly all of us, you, me, the audience, I'm sure we've had all of us, maybe not all, have had relationships with people that have fallen apart, and we've gotten horribly angry. And the question is what
you've met my two ex-wives, I can tell.
Somehow we also have to be models in our everyday life, which in a sense is forgiving the other person and trying to find common ground to move ahead. That's even happened to me in academia, of all places, where you're supposed to be searching for the truth, and relationships aren't all that crucial, but
it's
they
a
are.
shark bath, academia. That's all there is to it.
They are. That's right. But relationships are crucial to help stop this. When you mention the two sides should talk in some ways, definitely. But if they just talk through emissaries, or they just talk about the problems but not try to form some relationship, it's probably doomed. Forming relationships can help bring things along. It's really the most important factor in fighting in armies. You really put your emotions into your comrades, the people you fight with. And so that becomes the biggest connector, not the ideology, and so the Nazis, and probably many of the soldiers in this current Mideast war, they're fighting now for each other. And maybe the ideology is there, and second, and maybe they feel they're also fighting for their very lives, which is probably true right now. But it's the relationship with one another as comrades and soldiers that carry people through. So, social relationships, in my view, social relationships are key to everything. And that's where social psychiatry comes out of. Not to say it's easy, but that's where we have to put the emphasis. in everyday life and in these horrendous conflicts. And you mentioned politicians in the United States. You know, one of the sad things is the two sides, the Republicans and the Democrats, you know, in our government, you used to have friendly relationships outside of work. They drink beer together and so forth. That's not happening much anymore, which gives me pause that we're going to get through these internal conflicts in the United States anytime soon, because the relationships have been falling apart. And so then all you do is argue about the ideology and you don't come to common ground. So that's also very worrisome within the United States.
It's very true. And I mean, after the Second World War, there was still a friendly relationship between politicians and lots of bipartisan action, understanding. And now it's sort of the bargaining that goes on so that the government can keep functioning, so that the money is there. And you start getting deals that like, well, we're not going to agree to civil servants being paid unless you agree to give us money for the Ukraine war. And we're going, this is not in fact the way to do politics. This is childish and dangerous.
Yeah, it's not equivalent, and you're talking about different issues. So
yeah.
You know.
And so people start forcing issues, and we start seeing minority politics where to get 4 votes in the Senate, concessions will be made to those 4 senators, and that is not democracy.
Yeah. You know, now we do have some good examples to play off of. One of them, since we've been mentioning Germany and Nazis, is the United States and Israel came to peace after the war. Germany has been a great supporter of Israel, probably second only to the United States, and so on. I mean, could people have imagined after the war that that was what's going to happen? But they found common ground. Germany made reparations, which helped Israel develop, and Israelis started to move to Germany to live and found out that worked, at least for now. And so you can get over that horrendous conflict where genocide was the goal to work together again. In the United States, from the political spectrum, there is a group called Braver Angels, and they bring people together from both sides in small groups, lots of them, and get them to talk together about what they have in common and to try to understand the points of view without criticism. And those are working pretty good. You just need so many more of them, and you need the politicians to start attending a group like that. So, I mean, my own feeling is we need mental health professionals with knowledge about these conflictual relationships. I think we need them we need their consultation at the higher levels of the government, and I don't think that's happening, at least in the United States.
Yeah, I hope, you know, that there's somebody watching this who can help me. But I've been trying to get material about the denazification program after World War II for a long time. I found 2 books about a place called Wilton Park, and it would appear that there were 2 centres where denazification was practiced by the British Army. One of them was in Germany, where, to the shame of the British Army, people were tortured to try and get them to renounce their Nazi views. I know very little about this except that it failed completely, and that oddly enough, aversion therapy in this way doesn't work. At Wilton Park, something quite transformative happened, that they had hundreds of prisoners of war and they put them into discussion groups. And what I want to know, so I say I've read 2 books about it, but they don't give you any details of who set the discussions up and how they work. What we do know is that some very hardcore Nazis went into rooms to talk about how much they believed in Hitler and the Third Reich, and came out of those rooms going, we were wrong. What's more, people who went through this program became part of the Adenauer government in Germany, which sought to make reparation to the Jewish people. So we can see, you know, this movement of belief. We frequently misquote Voltaire on the show, and it was Spike who pointed out it was a misquote, and then I know she's still using it, but he's misquoted as saying people who believe absurdities may commit atrocities. And it was actually said by the second Prime Minister of India, Radhakrishnan, who was a professor of philosophy in real life. He put it that simply. Voltaire made this great big statement that's way more complicated than that. But I think that that's a really fundamental principle. When people believe absurdities, it makes it easy for them to commit atrocities. And when you look at how that is, anything to do with babies, that would be a start of it. In World War One, you had the idea that the German soldiers, when they went into Belgium, were chopping the hands off babies. And there was a member of parliament in Britain called Eric Ponsonby, who was so intrigued by this that he did his own investigation. The Belgian government and the American government after the war both did investigations too. And Ponsonby scored because he found the man who'd made the story up. He was a colonel in British intelligence. And this colonel laughed his head off. He said, and you wouldn't believe how many letters we got asking to adopt these babies. Roll on forward to the first invasion of Iraq. And there are congressional hearings. And a young woman of 15, before US congressional hearings, talks about having seen premature babies pushed out of their incubators in Kuwait City Hospital. Now, the reality was that this 15-year-old girl was the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the US. And on the day of the invasion, she was in New York City shopping. She was not in Kuwait City. And she was primed by Hill and Knowlton, public relations agency, one of the largest in the world, who at the time were also working for Scientology, as it happens. They were willing to do this, and they admitted this. This is all now in the record, that they made this story up about babies being tortured to bring us to this conclusion. And of course we respond to that. Of course, when we see these atrocities, we want something to happen about it. But I would say that what we should want to happen is that those who are guilty come to trial for what they have done, rather than seeking to obliterate anybody who speaks the same language that they speak, or has the same skin color, or practices the same religion. Mm-hmm. So we also, that takes into annihilation warfare, which is what we're seeing in Gaza. We've seen it in Syria. The Russians have done it in Syria. There's almost nothing left of that once beautiful country as a consequence of terrible activity there. But if we roll the clock back and we look to Vietnam, then more munitions were dropped on Vietnam than were dropped during the whole of the Second World War, it is said. So this tiny little country with 20 million people in it or something, with the idea of you obliterate your enemy, you get rid of them completely. The same thing had happened in North Korea. And it is fair to say that it was the North Koreans who started it, if we're going to get into anything. But what happened was that America leveled all of North Korea. There was not one town left standing. And people kind of wonder why North Korea is often this little cult away from the rest of the world, and why they don't like the Americans or the Australians or the British or the Turks who all fought there. But we get this skewed version where we don't realize what damage was done. At the same time as Vietnam, Britain was fighting a war in Borneo and Malaysia. Most British people have never heard of it, though there were hundreds of thousands of casualties on the other side. And the way there was this, I saw an interview with Dennis Healey, who was basically the Labour minister in charge of this war in the 1960s. He said, we kept getting approaches from the Americans saying, here, use some of our bombers, get rid of the jungle, spray it with Agent Orange, do what we're doing. And I say most British people don't realise that a war was fought in Borneo and Malaysia and won. And the way it was fought and won was not by saturation bombing. The British had done that at Dresden in World War II. No, nobody's innocent in this. But what they'd done was they'd infiltrated special air services units into the jungle. And it'd be a three-man team. You'd have a doctor, a linguist, and an explosives expert. And they'd be going to a village. And a linguist would, as quickly as possible, acquire the language of the people. The doctor would fix all the kids who'd got minor problems or what have you, and do whatever he could, while the guy who blew things up would sit and wait. And they basically were told by the tribal peoples living in the jungle of all the movements of the communist insurgent enemy. And they were able to strike. There was a loss of, I think, almost 200,000 people
Mm.
on the other side and 400 on the British side, because the campaign was waged by befriending the people who are actually going to be most affected by it.
Mm.
So it even shows that in military terms, it's good to make friends. If you make enemies, you can have more people to fight against you. And where on earth are we going to go now? That, you know, the objective of Israel is to destroy the Hamas tunnels. I absolutely understand that, but the way of going about it, especially, you know, what seem to be attacks on refugee camps, which make no sense at all. That the way of going about it, I get it. You want to clear all the population away from the mile or so leading up to the border and get rid of those tunnels and, you know, fill them in with concrete so they can't remake them. But that is a legitimate military objective. Whereas it's rather like the you know, the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, that a guy called Mark Sageman, a psychiatrist, who I think was with the Marines or Special Forces in Afghanistan and then qualified as a psychiatrist, and did a detailed analysis of Al Qaeda. And he worked out that there were just under 480 members of the 4 groups that are called Al Qaeda. 2 of them actually definitely not, including the Malaysian group and the Maghreb, the Northern African group, definitely not part of any command structure within. So they had less than 500 people in the 4 groups. By the time we were a month into the Iraq War, Al Qaeda had 35,000 people in it. So the law of unintended consequences, you know.
Well, yes, and that's an example of what happens if you try to completely obliterate, you know, the groups you're against. You may radicalize more people along the way, and so you end up not really getting rid of them anyways.
Mm. Don't tax people. Don't ask people to pay tax on tea. That's the thing I've learned from history. It's go badly wrong.
You know, in the back of this, you know, Israeli Gaza Hamas struggle, you know, we still have all the hostages, which complicates it, and people have sort of forgot about that as the war has gone on. But that whole situation is a key to moving forward, you know, unless they get sacrificed along the way, which is not impossible. It's probably more likely than not. So that's a terrible consequence now. You know, it's all the examples you mentioned again says how this is kind of a basic propensity of humans, and so that's what makes our work so difficult, you know. And you know, again, finding things that we have in common that are going to help each other, and trying to forgive and change the historical narrative, you know, by apologizing for past stuff. Now that would be terrific. I can't hardly imagine that would happen, you know. So I would say we shouldn't lose hope, but this is such a critical time now, because the ways we can obliterate each other are much more risky nowadays, whether that's nuclear, the slow growing climate change, toxins. There's just so many ways to obliterate each other that haven't been used to a great extent, but are there. And, you know, Russia threatening to use nuclear, and actually one of the bad side effects of the new war is that, at least overtly, we're kind of forgetting about the war in Ukraine and the invasion of Ukraine at the same time, because we're so focused on the Middle East, you know. But the issues are common, you know. Russia invaded Ukraine, just like the current invasion. What made that even worse is they telegraphed what they were going to do, and they still weren't stopped. So, and could have been. Yeah, the United States is, you know, no angel or hero in all this. I mean, we kept the war on terror going for 20 years in Afghanistan, and Vietnam, we lost that war. You know, we probably came to a peace in Korea just because we couldn't win that war. We haven't done very good in winning wars, let alone helping the countries recover. So we need to do some soul searching in the United States about, you know, how we approach these conflicts. We're also doing something wrong. So
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, what happened with ISIS and or ISIL or Daesh, whatever we're going to call it, that I don't think that most people outside of the Middle East have understood just how devastating the rise of Daesh was, that and why it happened, which is rather obvious, that because of the liberation of Iraq, it meant that the majority could rule, and the majority are Shiites who'd been out of power under Saddam Hussein. His Ba'ath Party was Sunni, and yeah, I think you have about 40% of Iraqis are Sunni and 60% Shiite, or that was those are the figures 20 years ago when the invasion happened, and that meant that through democracy, the Shiites came to completely control Iraq. The Sunnis had no voice in the government at all, and the way of dealing, I read a thing by the second in command of the project, to bring Iraq back together again. And she was a former U.S. ambassador and she said 2 weeks before we were sent, we were given the rough guide to Baghdad and the German constitution and told, go and sort it out. And we know it was the German constitution because they'd crossed out Reichsmarks all the way through. And so you get, so there was really no plan. You didn't know what you were going to do. You just wanted to have a bit of jingoism, a bit of chauvinism, if we're going to use the word properly, some bellicose patriotism. But no plan, no intelligence, no understanding. And so what happened was that the Republican Guard were just told to go home. And if you actually look at what ISIS is, it's a fully trained army. How did a fully trained army come together? Because they used to be the Republican Guard. And rather than giving them a job and trying to integrate these two warring forces, the Shiites and the Sunnis, it made everything worse. And the consequences will go down. If we don't make peace, we will make war. There are only two choices here. And that means that we have to be willing to forgive, which, if you've been personally, you've seen your children killed, and we are seeing, the horrible attack of Hamas, 1,400 people murdered. It's the only proper term. This was not a proper act of war in any sense. And I understand that they didn't feel they had any other way to do it. But in the end, that's caused the inevitable reaction. I think it's the wrong reaction. I think going and killing what they're now claiming nearly 10,000 Palestinians have died. And along with that, some of the hostages, it's said, have been hit by Israeli missiles because they were in places, they were being kept in those places. That's certainly not to the advantage of Hamas in any way. So we get this thing where it becomes internecine, that the two sides are they're going to destroy everyone on the other side. And I think there's a fundamental formulation, which is, and we're talking about musicians. Jimi Hendrix put this point of view forward, which is that we're all part of the same family.
Well, yeah, really. I mean, genetically and DNA wise, we certainly are. And somehow we got to make that an important part of everybody's identity. You're not just a person from such and such a country or such and such a religion, but we're all global citizens and have more in common than not. Another approach I've tried to look at over these recent years is religion in general. So and this, I was a lead editor first of a book on Islamophobia, which had a lot of internal conflict along the way between the psychiatrists who were of Islamic background and Jewish
Mm.
psychiatrists, Christian psychiatrists, and we had a whole diversity. And somehow we worked through that well enough, I think, by focusing on what we each could contribute and coming to compromises.
Mm.
We went on to anti-Semitism, had some of the same
Which is where
problems.
we met. That I
Yes,
co-authored
onto,
a piece for that.
onto Christianity and psychiatry, which was led by Dr. Petit, and he's such a gentleman. Plus,
Mm.
in a way, um, Christianity hasn't been quite as involved in the public conflicts we're involved with. Anyways, that went smooth. He probably helped it along. But this last book, to me, has been the most eye-opening of all. It's on the Eastern
Mm.
religions, spirituality, and psychiatry. And the underlying issue early on was who could speak about what?
Mm.
Could psychiatrists who weren't of an Eastern religion or spiritual background talk about issues involved with the Eastern religions? And what I had wanted to do is have Jewish psychiatrists in a section, have Jewish psychiatrists, Christian psychiatrists, and so on, give their perspective on the Eastern religions, saying that we're coming from a point of relative ignorance and humility, but curious. And there was a big conflict about whether we should do that or not, that we really didn't have the right to do that. And it's just a repetition of colonialism.
Mm.
We worked through that well enough to have that included, as well as a wide diversity in chapters, including yours with Steve Hassan on kind of
Oh, the
cultish
warnings. Yeah.
warning signs,
Mm.
which was also controversial, by the way, which I probably didn't tell you as much as I could have. Lots of controversy about that.
Mm.
And so I was thinking also going into it, well, maybe the Eastern religions handle conflict between people better than the Western ones, so-called Western ones. They're really Middle Eastern ones rather than Western ones,
Mm.
because they all come out of the Mideast. But anyways, so Hinduism, I was quick to realize, no, there's been as much conflict that they've been part of, either forced into or went into.
Mm.
Their conflict nowadays, especially against Muslims in India.
The Pink
And,
Revolution. Yeah.
yeah, and the fundamentalist kind of Hindus. Now, Buddhism may be a different sort. You know, I think some of the sects there do have a history of violence and so forth. But one of the things I love about Buddhism, and my best friend was Buddhist most of his adult life, is their emphasis on compassion.
Mm.
And I think that's one of the things you want to emphasize in trying to look at these conflicts, to have compassion, especially for all the innocents, but even for the perpetrators and the
Mm.
soldiers,
I
especially.
agree.
You know, the amount of mental health problems that are going to come out of the soldiers who live through this Mideast war is going to be horrendous.
Mm.
There's going to be lots of PTSD,
Mm.
lots of moral injuries for being involved in what they've done, grief with losses and so forth. So the mental health of the military, really on both sides, the ones that live it's going to take its toll later on.
Mm.
And it's another reason we need compassion for them too. Not saying everything they're doing is right,
Mm.
but they are human beings, and we need to maintain compassion, which of course is a mainstay of medicine.
Mm.
If physicians don't have compassion for their patients, then they're just technicians.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
and they'll be replaced by artificial intelligence.
Yeah. Any minute now. We'll have Elon Musk dictating what happens to us instead.
Yeah, yeah.
One of the things that I looked at in some depth, I wrote a couple of novels about really relating to the British hippie movement, particularly a novel called Halcyon Days, which is set in the mid-60s. And in the lead up to doing that, I've known of, I grew up through the hippie period. I was 12 in the summer of love. And, I grew my hair long when I was 14 and all of this stuff. I saw Jimi Hendrix at the Isle of Wight, which is great. But I knew quite a lot of American hippies, and they were a different breed. There was something else going on that was not like the British hippie. And I think it is because Britain kept its war quiet and didn't draft people, didn't have conscripts. And because the casualties were in the hundreds rather than for the US in the tens of thousands, the deaths in the tens of thousands, it didn't have the same impact on the culture. And I started to wonder if, saturating a culture with post-traumatic stress was, where would that go? And did that explain some of the political vehemence, vituperance that we see in the US, the incredible hatred between groups? You're looking at, I'm reading Martin Luther King's Why We Can't Wait at the moment. And what a brilliant book. But on the way into that, and this is all because of Charlie Manson, Charlie Manson was terrified of the Black Panthers. He thought he'd killed one, and he thought they were going to come and get him, and he hadn't killed him, and he wasn't a Black Panther. But there you go, Charlie Manson wasn't necessarily very sane. And I wanted to know, well, why was he so scared of the Black Panthers? So I read some stuff about Malcolm X, as one of the first, Elijah Muhammad, the first advocates of black violence. And then I read about Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and Eldridge Cleaver, and sort of went, and reading Martin Luther King saying, oh, finally, we've come to the third revolution in America, the Negro Revolution. That's a word that we don't use anymore. Yes. But nonetheless, he calls it the Negro Revolution, so I'm sticking with that. And he's saying, at last we've arrived at nonviolence and we're getting somewhere. And this, he's talking about 1963. And so quickly after that, it degenerates into violence. And while the Black Panthers did feed a lot of children breakfast, though they did firebomb one shop for not giving them the eggs they wanted. So, it may not be the approach I'd recommend. But they also had a standard message, and all three of the leaders I've mentioned publicly said, if you want to help the revolution, get a gun and shoot a cop. And you see the collapse of everything, what Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King died for is thrown away because of the trauma in the culture. Because I can, absolutely understand the Watts riots. I can understand the Days of Rage in Chicago. It makes sense to me that these things happen because there was an explosion that was going to happen because of the failure to debate, because of the failure to discuss, to look at the interests of the people involved. So Watts went from being a pretty successful Black urban community into being a ghetto, that all the employment went away, that government did nothing to help these people. And it's like the Oklahoma bombing in 1922, where white folks decided the black folks were doing too well, so the first aerial combat against it ever in the United States was local white people dropping bombs from airplanes on black people. When things become that polarized, it's got to be time to stop and say, is there a way out of this? Is there a future, or will we spend from now to eternity killing each other, hating each other, being consumed by hatred, living hateful lives, fearful lives? Is there some way of bringing about dialogue? And in those terms, one of the strangest events in British politics was the friendship between Michael McGuinness and Ian Paisley. And McGuinness had been a member of the Provisional Irish Republican Army's Council, the Army Council, which ordered murders. There are no two ways about it. It ordered killings. And on the other hand, on the other side, you had Ian Paisley, the most vocal anti-Catholic member of the Northern Irish community. Both very powerful figures. And after the Troubles ended, they both became part of the Northern Irish Parliament at Stormont. And there is film of them sitting together, laughing and talking with each other. And this became so prominent that there's a comedy duo called the Chuckle Brothers, who are rather foolish. And that became the term of reference for Paisley and McGuinness. Now, if those two men who had hated each other for that long were actually able to share jokes, then there might be hope for us all. But it's only when we can come to that level of understanding that we can get past these problems, I think.
That's right. Again, the relationship may be key, and you bring in humor, which is so important. I mean, humor can have a negative edge to it or negative content, but positive humor is so therapeutic.
Yeah, and where we're willing to deprecate ourselves, where we're willing rather than deprecating the other.
Yeah, that humility that I mentioned before. Yeah, and yeah, this history of racism in the United States has been so difficult. I think there is the legacy of the intergenerational transmission of trauma, so that it affects generation after generation. But we have moved forward. I think, interestingly now, in that conflict, there hasn't been hardly any violence or call for violence. What we have now, I think, left over is the conflict over, quotes, wokeism, which is a conflict, in essence, saying that all whites are to blame what happened and you have to correct your ways, whether you realize it or not. I don't think that's going very far, actually, because it doesn't play on people's positive feelings, whites' positive feelings toward blacks, nor affirm that you weren't really involved with all of this, but you can help. The negativity is what I think pulls whites away. And who is included in being white is also a problem. And I think I've said this before, terminology is a big deal, I think. And we have divisive terminology. The whites and blacks, I mean, you can't get two more opposite colors. Well, they're really not colors, but black and white are such opposites. Why do you want to label people in that divisive way, other than it's simple and it gets attention? But our skin colors are shades of really browns, all the way from very light brown up to darker brown. Probably black doesn't even really qualify as a skin color, but we use that. And I think that's not simple, but I think we have to keep those smaller divisive things going on and change them. There's a jazz musician, since we always talk some about jazz, Wynton Marsalis, the most, I guess, popular jazz musician of our time.
And a brilliant man, just a really clever man. Yeah.
That's right. He is brilliant, and he does trumpeter. Social commentary, which I think is quite helpful. So he says, stop using those terms. We should use the term hues. We're of different kinds of hues, HUES, and that we all have different kinds of hues. Let's use that. And I'm all with him on that. So, and there's another prominent black intellectual, Mr. McWhorter.
Yep.
MC,
who's a linguist by
trade.
Again, a brilliant man.
Yeah, who knows what terminology means and writes from the New Yorker. Everybody should be reading his columns. He's brilliant and tries to bring people together, and also doesn't think the terminology we use now it's more harmful than helpful. So, I love those crossing boundaries, people who can take a different point of view than is being espoused. I think that's where our solutions lie. I think there's a term for that too. It's liminal space, the space between, kind of two opposites. And there's liminal leadership, where you can lead between two organizations. And I think that's where a lot of creative solutions can arise from.
I agree, and I think that color, race, these are false distinctions. That when we talk about racism, um, actually there is only one race of human beings. We are
Yeah.
genetically 99.8% or something identical to one another. And when we see division, we see divisiveness.
Hmm.
So, and the same with women versus men, or kids versus old people like me. Um, I I was fascinated by William Du Bois, and I'm told his name is Du Bois, not Dubois, as I would want to pronounce it in the
Yeah,
French.
yeah,
But Du Bois, somewhere around about, I think it was 1902, and please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. I think it was about 1902 that William Du Bois coined the phrase "the religion of whiteness." Now, it is. I don't think it's particularly consequential. Du Bois happened to be black. I say that doesn't. But what he identified was really interesting, and I got interested in it. And it's kind of, when you look back through history, even through the horrors of the slave trade, the early slave trade, the African slave trade, nobody is being criticized for being black. The idea of black and white seems to have emerged culturally at a single point in 1676. And again, somebody will correct me, I'm sure, if I'm wrong, when Bacon's Rebellion happened in the New England colony. And a group of black slaves, and there may well have been some white slaves among them, because, of course, Cromwell had exported the Irish, thousands of Irish to the West Indies and the colonies. There may have been some Scots among them as well, because they had a bit of a hard time, but they were actually going to get it a bit more in the next century. So 1745, the rebellion, that sort of thing. But nonetheless, there were some white, but predominantly black group of slaves joined together with a group of white indentured servants. Now, an indentured servant is somebody who's a slave for a period of time. That's pretty much what it means. And because originally such people couldn't read and write, there'd be an indenture, which is something would be bitten, and one half of the contract would remain with the person, and you could put the two together because their teeth would be really fascinating stuff you find out here, isn't it? No use whatsoever to anybody. But this idea of the religion of whiteness, what happened after Bacon's Rebellion, which was very successful, it went on for weeks, and the British Army were not able to suppress it. And the rebels, rather mischievously, managed to put the drug datura into the food of the soldiers, it is said. So they were in this weird hallucinogenic state, delirious state, for some period of time. But there was this, up until then, it had been possible to separate out the blacks by saying they're heathens, they're pagans, they're not Christians. But the Quakers and others had started converting them, and now they were joining together with white people in an attempt to gain rights, which they most certainly deserved. And to put this in context, white indentured servants were also beaten, starved, and treated horribly. It's the people doing it that we should be angry at, not the color of their skin. And so this division happened. I think that laws started to be put in place that basically gave the white servants higher status. They didn't really get anything other than higher status. And this is where the idea of being black becomes the idea of being inferior. I don't think, and again, please do correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, I don't think that there's anything really significant before this. We've got Shakespeare's Othello, who's a black man, but he's a ruler. He's not looked down upon in that sense. So we start getting this division, and then it's worked on in the same way. What's happening in Ukraine at the moment is part of pan-Slavism. And outside of the Slavic countries, people haven't really got that. At the same time that pan-Germanism rose up around about 1900, around about the time of the religion of whiteness being identified, the Austro-Hungarian army was having terrible problems because they had different languages. And out of this came a division that was pan-Germanic on one part, which is the Austrian part, and pan-Slavic on the other, which represents quite a lot of the countries who were under the rule of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And those two movements continued from that day to this. It brought us the Nazi war, but it's also bringing us this idea that is called neo-traditionalism in Russia, where they're saying that, and Alexander Dugin is the mouthpiece of this. And this is the idea that it would be best for the Slavs to be a separate people under the rule of an emperor, and get a good return to serfdom. I don't know why the Russian people are supporting this. They may not have understood what serfs were. They may think it's, you get holidays and get to go to exotic places or something and get paid loads of money. It's not true. Serfdom was not a good thing. So you've got a war that's being fought based upon an absurdity. Atrocities are being committed because people believe, and they don't really understand, that there will be somewhere an ideal world that comes about when the Slavs are separate from the German speakers, and the blacks and the whites have their own nations, with Louis Farrakhan ruling one and Richard Spencer ruling the other, maybe. These absolutely absurd ideas, which when you think them through are not in any way possible. Marcus Garvey's return to Africa. So 2-3 centuries later, you're going to go back to this other place. You're going to pull up all of the roots that you and 10 generations before you have laid down and go back there. Well, we saw that in Liberia, and it didn't work very well. That was the 19th century attempt at doing it. So in the end, it is a matter of, rather than separating ourselves, of how do we bring ourselves together? How do we tolerate other people's beliefs? And of course, through the books that you've been editing, and what a task it must have been, what a Herculean task you've taken on in looking at these topics. And you ended up with somebody like me, who's an agnostic and not a psychiatrist, writing a book about Eastern spirituality, another one about anti-Semitism. I'm not Jewish either. And that's
we needed more like you. Actually, I tried to recruit non-religious psychiatrists, especially atheists, for the books, and it was almost impossible to do. That's another big division between psychiatrists who are avert with their religion and those who aren't. Yeah, well, there's all these different divisiveness. One is skin color, then there's socioeconomic status, gender, so on and so forth. It's not an easy task whatsoever. I would add something, since you started with skin color. I may have said this in a prior interview. I think there's a psychological influence also. I got curious at one time, maybe at least 30 years ago, probably 40 years ago, about why so many Americans with light skin color wanted to suntan. Why did they want to get darker skin?
The desire for skin cancer among white people.
Well, yeah, and they did know it was temporary, but it was curious, why that was popular. Less so now that we know about the skin cancer, but it led me to think, why a darker skin? And I thought, well, maybe there's some identification with darker skin colored people. Is there any preference for light skin over dark skin? And then my research back then, which might be quite flawed by now, because I haven't looked at it again, is that generally speaking, lighter skin colored people have more power than darker skin people, and are more afraid of darker skin people rather than darker skin of light skin. In fact, the countries where the light-skinned imperialists, like from Great Britain, came to some of the countries, they were welcomed because they had this light white skin that meant they were somebody angelic and were going to come and help the people instead of conquering them like they did. And
the Aztecs made that mistake. Whoops.
Yeah, Yeah, and I think it relates some to the darkness of night and the natural scariness of what happens at night. But I think we also have that psychological factor, which I think should not be ignored. It's may not be the major factor, but I think that's there too, and we should try to recognize that and deal with it, and reassure people that you know, the nighttime isn't necessarily always the scariest and worst time. You know,
Well,
most of our mass shootings occur during the daytime.
yeah, good point. Yeah, it's the people who are awake during the day that we've got to be worried about.
Yes,
I,
yes, yes.
I have a delayed sleep wake disorder, as it's called. Why it's a disorder, I don't know. And when I was first diagnosed 30 years ago, it was believed that less than 2% of people have this condition. It's genetic, it's fixed. If you try and change it, you'll be sleepy all the time and fatigued, and all sorts of things will happen. And that's not good. And it's now estimated by Matthew Walker, who's a professor of neurology and sleep medicine at Berkeley, that 30% of people have this condition. And having lived with it since I was 11 years old, which is 57 years now, it is amazing that when I tell people about it, the common reaction used to be, "Oh, lucky you can stay up at night." That there was some advantage to being sleepy all day long, and for 10 years I just got up and slept through the weekends as much as I could, which is what people tend to do when they have this condition.
Yeah.
But again, there's this darkness and light thing. You're a night creature. You're a person of the night. And it's sort of, since we've had, we had hemp oil lamps in the 18th century. Since we've had lighting, why is this relevant? But there is this simplistic division between dark and light. You see it again in handedness, that about 6% of the human population, and I'm told 50% of chimpanzees, so there's no explanation for this, about 6% of human beings are left-handed. And there we go. And I seem to know a disproportionate amount of people who are, and I've even got a child who is. And I'm married to a woman who is. It's just, what are you going to do? The 6% came and got me. But the right hand is called Dexter, not to be confused with the serial killer played by Michael C. Hall. And one is dexterous. One is dexterous, and one could be ambidextrous. The left hand is called sinister.
Yeah.
Go figure.
Yeah, we've always been discriminated against, although in the United States, most of the recent presidents have been left-handed, for better or worse.
There's a thought. So basically, the lefties are taking over. The Southpaws are going to be ruling the world soon if we're not really careful, people. But yeah, the thought, you'd have your left hand strapped down and be forced to use your right hand for things. There's still people in my mother's generation that was common for. And what a ridiculous idea that you're going to overrule the way the brain is wired. Again, the same, with my sleep thing, that it's written into your genetics, it's in your brain, and taking melatonin and having blue light to wake up, which is what sleep clinics will tell you to do, actually doesn't work. The last study I saw in it said that 42% of people had responded to it, which is a little bit over placebo. But you don't know what the response is. There's no proper measure of health. And measures of health suggest that if you deny yourself sleep, your immune system won't function as well as it could, and you'll feel rotten. And we live in a world where that's commonplace, in fact, of course, that sleep deprivation, about 30% of people are reckoned to have it as a daily thing.
That's right.
But we see a group of people who are divided because of some sense of color. And if I can come back to one of the ideas in this is this white people apologizing to Chinese people, black people, whoever. And when I was researching the life of L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, he, of course, was a pulp fiction writer. He largely wrote Westerns, but people insist he was a science fiction writer because the last couple of years he was, before he found a better way of actually making money. So he contributed to astounding science fiction, which was edited by a man who, unlike Ron Hubbard, actually was a nuclear physicist, called John Campbell Jr. And so I had to read his letters to understand his, because he was the guy that promoted Hubbard into the public view before decrying him as a complete charlatan about a year later, which didn't seem to get the same headlines. And there's a letter where Campbell says that, and he's writing in the 1950s, an angry young black man had come up to him and accused him of doing all of these things to his people. And Campbell said, stop right there. I can trace my ancestry to Scotland. None of my ancestors ever held slaves. We signed petitions, as of course did 400,000 people in Great Britain, against slavery. So you're accusing me of something that I have no part of. And let me point out something. It is an unfortunate fact that if your ancestors were slaves in this country, then it's very likely that some of your ancestors were slave owners because of the rape of slaves, of house slaves particularly. And so shouldn't you be apologizing to yourself for what your ancestors did to you? It just becomes so incredibly complicated when you say collective guilt. Mengele, the angel of death at Auschwitz, his son, I think, was 4 years old when Mengele fled the Allies. Mengele was a horrific human being, a dreadful human being. And his son had no real memory of him, didn't know him, and spent his life researching what his father had done and making it public, letting people know what had been done. So the idea of collective guilt would say, well, we couldn't get Mengele, but we could lock his son up. And the generation's gone. This is another place. This is a time to talk about forgiveness and reconciliation. And most certainly giving something back. We have a family called the Trevelyan's here, and Laura Trevelyan is a BBC News reporter, and they made a great splash, I think it was earlier this year or last year, by giving £100,000 to one of the Caribbean islands where their forebears had kept slaves. And I kind of went, so you've given them enough money to build a house, pretty much. That's not going to do very much, is it? But why are you feeling guilty? And if your present wealth is based upon what you did, you should give it all away. And maybe the reparations, the North-South reparations, rather than giving, 40 acres and 2 mules? Is that what Abe Lincoln promised black people after in Reconstruction? Rather than giving them, and what you're going to do with 2 mules these days, I'm not really sure, but rather than doing that, making sure that people have education, making sure that people have justice, making sure they have water, desalination plants around the world, making sure they have energy, and making reparation by making a world where people have better standards of living, rather than using, particularly the Pacific Rim, as slave states to produce toys for our children that can be thrown in the trash. This bizarre situation we've come to where our own unemployment is massive because there are economies where you can force people to work for indecently small amounts of money. That the whole construction of this capitalist communist warfare, these two camps, that it's like, let's be humanist. Let's look towards giving people a voice. And as you've tried to do with these books, it shouldn't prohibit anybody from talking about something, even if they don't know anything about it. It's a good thing that they say what they don't know. And if you can engage with them and give them better information, and always be working against the hatred they feel, the justification they feel in doing harm to others, which we call criminality when it's within our own culture. But if it's against some oppressed and some population we hate, it can be lauded and applauded. I think that's important. And as you say, and as we've both said repeatedly through these conversations, humility and compassion. These are the two lights that we have to try and follow.
Yeah, and even emphasizing those is a slow process and has to be done over and over. There's nothing fast about this, or
No.
Well, I guess there is, but it's not practical to use right now, which is psychedelics. So many people have experience with psychedelics. They don't get a bad trip, or is that it makes them have more cosmic connected feelings toward other people. So, but practically speaking, even if that's true and we could find the right dose of whatever psychedelic to give people, would we want to do that on a more mass scale? I doubt it, but it's there. You know, our wiring can be rewired, and psychedelics seem to offer the quickest way to do that.
Mm.
On the other hand, you know, we also have, I mean, thinking about drugs and all this is interesting and important. You know, we certainly have alcohol all over the place, which is legal and has been. Alcohol tends to make people meaner,
Mm.
not nicer. So that's an obstacle. And then if you look at many of these recent wars, what has been given to soldiers, including the invaders from Gaza, were the strongest stimulants around, which makes you feel invulnerable, gives you energy so you don't sleep. And look at what they contribute.
Mm.
I was just reading an article about how ISIS was more or less conquered. I think you brought that up before. And the Americans took a relative handful of soldiers, gave them their biggest guns, and just said, shoot them continuously. And they made these loudest noises and noise waves. And most of these soldiers ended up with traumatic brain injury. But it worked, but they ended up with traumatic brain injury. And they were also given stimulants.
Mm.
And so, you know, drugs can also make everything worse. So it's important to think about their potential role in the future also. Marijuana, maybe more of a calming effect than you know, precipitant of violence, but
Mm.
people, you know, most people use at least one kind of drug, and should
Mm.
think about how that's affecting them as far as how they relate to other people.
I, I think that's incredibly important. I think what you say is incredibly relevant, and we should come back to it and discuss it at length because of that. I did a piece with Chris Shelton because he wanted to talk about psychedelics and
Mm,
what as he's beginning to think, uh, you know, psychedelics can have a very positive effect, which I think is true. I think, yeah, I was extremely annoyed when one of my kids was given an anti-drug book that had all sorts of false information in it. It was distributed by a group who call themselves DARE, which is a US-based group, and I wrote to the president of, well, I wrote to DARE in the UK and got a letter back from the president, and I said, these pieces of information, can you give me sources for these pieces of information? So the idea that cannabis causes cancer, for example, could you give me a source for that? And he wrote back and he said, you can find the information on the internet. And I sort of, yeah, I have found the information, and it tells me that what you're telling me is not in fact true. Um, so, but one of the things that was said in another little booklet that came out was that the Germans and the Japanese used amphetamines during World War II. Now, I happen to know a woman who was a nurse during the Battle of Britain who was giving amphetamines to British pilots. So, and that will be the drug, as you say, it used properly, it seems to be helpful with people who have ADHD. I'm really not tremendously happy about Ritalin and Adderall being given to children. That's still, but if it's all that works, then okay. But with adults, this whole idea of prohibition, of saying you can't take that, you're not allowed to do that, rather than if you do damage to society, we will do something. And then looking at the studies in the 50s and 60s using LSD with psychiatric patients, where there were some very positive results.
yeah, for sure.
Um,
Yes,
and then there's this, well, we better stop it. The one that fascinates me is MDMA, also called ecstasy,
right. Yeah,
which
the
has been
party drug.
a
Yeah.
party, yeah, as a party drug, as ecstasy, which has been successful in trials for post-traumatic stress disorder,
Hmm.
combat stress, indeed. I don't know enough about that aspect of it to talk about it, but I know it's been successful. And they had something like 90% of people responding saying it had helped, which with
Yes.
PTSD is an incredibly high number. You know,
Yes.
if you could even get to 40 or 50%, you'd be getting somewhere. But
Yes.
I saw this. I was living in the south of England when the ecstasy rave culture hit in the late 80s and early 90s. And what I saw, which is, we used to dismiss this as anecdotal evidence. Now we talk about real world evidence, which I think is a bit more sensible. I used to go for a walk at 1 or 2 in the morning, most early mornings, and I'd walk through the town. On Friday night, Saturday morning, Saturday night, Sunday morning, there would be paddy wagons out full of police at 1 o'clock in the morning because people would be knifed outside these clubs. And then the ecstasy thing happened and there were no more knifings.
Yeah.
There were people going, "Oh, I love you, mate." You know, alcohol can do that too. But it changed psychiatrically and psychologically. It changed people's behavior. And it was made illegal after 10 years of use in psychotherapy with lots of, I remember reading one psychiatrist saying it had more effect from one dose of MDMA with a patient than a year's therapy, that what they were able to get into. So in the right situation, you know, but we should talk about this at tremendous length, I think, maybe the next time we meet.
Yeah, it's so important. Yeah, I agree with you. I saw from a distance the use of MDMA in psychotherapy sessions, and adding appropriate psychotherapy, and you have the best of both worlds. And you know, it was done for a while before the government finally got involved, and actually the harm of that particular psychedelic is pretty limited. You know, it's relatively safe, and so removing it from formal use, and what you said is the crucial part. You know, appropriate use of it, you know, is for all drugs. You know, drugs outside of prescribed drugs. Well, actually, prescribed drugs to use appropriately, just like you mentioned, Ritalin and so forth. It's probably way overused now, but when it's really needed, it helps so much. It changes people's lives around, especially kids, but you overuse it and it makes everything worse. So,
yeah. Grand. Well, what a pleasure it is talking with you. And we will book another session in after we've finished. Thank you to everybody for watching. And let me make just one little note here. About probably half of my audience are people who've been involved with Scientology. And in Scientology, one is made phobic about psychiatrists. It's not, I never had this because I knew a psychiatrist who was a friend of mine when I was a teenager. And so when Ron Hubbard said that all psychiatrists, psychotherapists, and psychologists were part of a conspiracy to destroy all life in the universe, I thought he'd been taking drugs because that was not my experience. But I was horrified to find that the majority of Scientologists accepted this idea that people like you, Stephen, are evil and part of a conspiracy. And my response to that is the response that if you put two rabbis in the room, you'll get three opinions. I've heard this. And the same in my experience is true of psychiatrists, psychotherapists, psychologists, that there is no conspiracy. Right? So I just want to point out to anybody who's managed to last this long into the conversation and who has been involved with Scientology that psychiatrists can be really nice people. And Stephen is one of the best. So there we go. Thanks so much for watching.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. And when I was doing clinical work, I tried, my modus of operation was to ask people what they preferred to be done, or if we ever started medication, do you like it? Do you not? Do you want to change? I followed their lead, actually. I tried to put in my knowledge, but I didn't try to force anybody or try to brainwash them in any way. You know, I wanted their freedom of mind to increase, not decrease. So.
Absolutely. And I had a friendship with Betty Tilden, who was a remarkable psychiatrist working in this country, and the only psychiatrist who realized that cults were a terrible problem. And she devoted, you know, she was well into her retirement by the time I met her, but she was still working. She never stopped. And she did a tremendous amount of good helping people who'd been through a terrible authoritarian cult experience. And she was harassed severely by Scientology for years as a consequence of that. So, you know, if there's anybody watching this who's harassing a psychiatrist, stop it. It's not a good thing to do.
Please, please. our work is hard enough. Yeah.
Great. Thanks so much, Steve.
Yeah. And thank you for having me, and thank everybody out there watching this.
Yeah. Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.